He was repairing an orc girl's armor. Then she whispered, "Go ahead." Kael did not look up. His world was the size of the dented steel plate resting on his anvil. It was a small world, and he liked it that way. The stale smell of coal smoke, quenching oil, and old winters clung to the forge's stone walls. It was the only perfume he knew. Outside, the endless drizzle of a late autumn turned the narrow track to his door into black sludge. No one ever used the track. That, too, he liked. His life was a simple rhythm. Heat, hammer, cool, repeat. It was a life built from the ashes of a different one, a life he did not think about. He'd found the armor, half buried in the scree at the bottom of the western pass a week ago. A gorget, finely made but battered, its edges twisted like hardened leather. It was orc work, no doubt about it. The layered plates, the brutal functionality of it. He had no business with it, no customer for it. But the craftsman in him couldn't leave it to rust. So he worked. He heated the metal until it glowed like a trapped sunset, his hammer falling in the steady, familiar cadence that was his only conversation. He was straightening the last of the curve when the sound came. It wasn't the wind, which moaned constantly through the valley's teeth. It wasn't the hiss of the rain. It was a crash, wood splintering, close. His hammer stopped mid-swing. The silence that rushed in was heavy, expectant. He set the hammer down without a sound, his hand moving by instinct to the heavy, forging tong beside the hearth. It wasn't a sword, but it had weight. It would do. He moved to the thick oak door, his worn boots making no noise on the stone floor. He listened. Rain, wind, and then a sound so alien in his solitude it made the hairs on his arm stand up. A child's whimper, low and terrified. It was followed by a harsh, guttural whisper, a sound like gravel being ground under a boot. Orc. He peered through the small spy hole he drilled in the door years ago. The world outside was a wash of grey and deepening twilight. For a moment, he saw nothing but the swaying pines. Then, a shape resolved itself from the gloom. An orc, a female, tall and broad-shouldered even when hunched against the rain. She was leaning against the wall of his woodshed, one hand braced against the damp logs. In the crook of her other arm, she held a small, shivering bundle. The child. Her face, half hidden by a tangle of wet, black hair, was a mask of granite and pain. A dark stain was spreading across the leather of her tunic, high on her left side. Behind her, farther down the path, he saw them. Torches. A handful of them, bobbing and weaving through the trees like angry fireflies. They were searching, hunting. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to his forge work. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive and alone for 10 years, screamed at him. Bar the door, douse the forge fire, be a stone, be nothing. They would pass, they always passed. But the whimper came again, a thin, hopeless little sound, and his eyes were drawn back to the child. A girl, he thought, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Her face was buried in her mother's shoulder, tiny hands clutching a fistful of tunic. His carefully constructed wall of solitude, built brick by lonely brick over a decade, developed a crack. It was a small crack, but it was there. He thought of another child, another rainy night. He shoved the thought away hard, but the crack remained. The orc mother pushed herself off the wall, stumbling. She took 2 steps toward his forge, then faltered, her gaze fixed on the faint orange glow that leaked from under his door. She knew someone was here. She was trapped between the hunters behind and the unknown ahead. He saw her jaw tighten, a decision hardening in her eyes. She would not die cowering in the rain. He pulled back from the spy hole, his knuckles white on the forging tong. This was madness. Inviting this into his home was inviting death. Orcs brought nothing but trouble, and hunted orcs brought the worst kind. He knew the stories. He knew their blood feuds were like forest fires, consuming everything in their path. But the image of the child's small, shaking form was seared into his mind. He was a man who had spent 10 years convincing himself he had nothing left to lose. He was about to find out if that was true. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt like lifting a mountain, he drew back the heavy iron bolt on his door. The door swung inward with a low groan. Cold, wet air flooded the forge, carrying the scent of pine and mud. The orc woman froze, her head snapping up. Her eyes, the colour of dark amber, locked onto his. They were filled with a terrifying mix of defiance and desperation. Her hand moved to the hilt of a wicked-looking axe tucked in her belt. The child whimpered again, louder this time. He didn't speak. He just stood there, holding the heavy tong, a silent, grim-faced man in a leather apron. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the warmth of the forge fire behind him. An invitation. An incredibly stupid invitation. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over him, the forge, the shadows in the corners. She was assessing him, weighing the threat. He could see the calculation in her eyes. He was human, small by her standards, not a warrior. He was a risk, but the torches in the woods were a certainty. Slowly, painfully, she limped across the threshold. She moved like a wounded wolf, every step a fresh agony, but her eyes never left him. The child, Urka he would later learn she was called, peeked out from her mother's shoulder, her wide green eyes full of a fear so profound it felt ancient. Once inside, the mother didn't relax. She shuffled sideways, putting her back to the stone wall, her gaze still locked on him, her hand still resting on her axe. Kael closed the door and slid the bolt home. The sound was unnervingly final. The world outside, the hunters and the rain was shut out. But a new, far more immediate danger was now shut in. The silence in the forge was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the child's quiet, hitching breaths. The orc woman's breathing was shallow and ragged. The dark stain on her tunic was larger now, glistening in the firelight. He gestured with the tongue toward the worn wooden stool near the hearth. "Sit," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones scraping together. She did not move. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" The word was a growl, low and suspicious. Kael gave a short, humorless puff of air. "Lady, if I wanted you dead, I'd have left you in the rain for them." He pointed again with the tongue. "You're bleeding on my floor. Sit." Her gaze flickered down to the wound, then back to his face. She was wavering. The pain and blood loss were wearing down her formidable defenses. He saw the struggle, the pride warring with the primal need to protect her child. He took a step back, deliberately creating space, and set the tongue down by the hearth. He held up his empty hands, an act of trust he did not feel. "Your choice." Finally, her shoulders slumped just a fraction. With a pained grunt, she lowered herself onto the stool, carefully cradling the child in her lap. The little one immediately hid her face again, burrowing into the relative safety of her mother. Kael watched them for a moment, the great, wounded warrior and her terrified daughter, huddled by his fire. He had just invited a storm into his house. He had no idea if he could survive it. He went to the shelf where he kept his medical supplies, a small, curated collection of herbs, clean linen, and a needle and gut thread. He had become proficient at mending his own injuries over the years. He hoped it was enough. When he turned back with the supplies, her eyes were on him again, sharp and wary. Her hand was back on her axe. "I need to see the wound," he said, his tone flat and practical. She said nothing, just watched him. He knew this was a critical moment. He knelt, not too close, and placed the supplies on the floor between them. He didn't reach for her. He waited. He was giving the choice back to her. He could see the war in her face. To allow him to touch her, to tend to her wound, was an act of profound vulnerability. It was admitting she needed help. From a human. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the fire and the storm. The torches outside seemed to have moved on, their light fading from the gaps in his window shutters. For now. Then, with excruciating slowness, she released the hilt of her axe. Her hand moved to the ties of her leather tunic. Her fingers fumbled, slick with rain and blood. With a soft curse, she gave up. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a warrior, but a desperate mother. Her pride was a fortress, but the walls were crumbling. "I'll sleep in the barn," she rasped, her voice thick with pain. "With the girl. Just don't send her away. Please." The plea hit him harder than any physical blow could have. It was the sound of a proud spirit breaking. He had expected threats, demands, aggression. He had not expected this. This raw, desperate bargain. She was offering to humble herself, to sleep with animals, all for the sake of her child. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement. "No barn," he said. He moved forward slowly, his hands in plain sight. "Let me help. For her." He nodded toward the child. Something in his voice, in his simple, unconditional offer, must have reached her. The last of the fight seemed to drain out of her. She gave a stiff, jerky nod. He moved closer, his hands gentle as he worked at the wet leather ties of her tunic. The material was thick and stubborn. Underneath, she wore a simple linen shirt, now soaked through with blood. It was a clean wound, a deep gash from a blade, but it had bled profusely. It needed stitching. "This will hurt," he said, his voice low. A faint, grim smile touched her lips. "Everything hurts." He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with boiled water and pungent herbs. She hissed in pain, her whole body tensing, but she did not cry out. The child in her lap, Urka, watched him with wide, unblinking eyes, her fear so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the room. He tried to ignore her gaze, focusing on the task. The needle, the thread, the careful pulling of stitches through tough, green-tinged skin. He was a smith, used to mending iron. Mending flesh was not so different, he told himself. It required a steady hand and a focus on the mechanics of the repair. When he was finished, he bandaged the wound tightly with clean linen. He could feel the heat of her skin, the powerful muscle coiled beneath. She was built like a bulwark, a living wall of strength. Yet here she was, broken and bleeding in his forge. He stood up and moved to the pot of stew that was always simmering over his fire. It was simple fare, roots, dried meat, barley, but it was hot and filling. He ladled a generous portion into 2 of his 3 wooden bowls. He placed one on the floor beside her stool. The other, a smaller portion, he held out toward the child. Urka shrank back, pressing herself tighter against her mother. The woman, he still didn't know her name, murmured something in the harsh, guttural orc tongue. It sounded reassuring. She took the bowl from him herself, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was calloused and cool. She held the bowl for her daughter, coaxing her to eat. Kael retreated to the far side of the forge, giving them their space. He ate his own stew standing up, his back against the cold stone wall, his eyes never leaving them. He had crossed a line. His quiet, ordered world was gone. He had let the storm in, and now he had to see it through. He watched the mother, Gorza, spoon stew into her daughter's mouth before taking any for herself, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze constantly scanning the room. Even in this moment of respite, she was a guardian. He was no longer just a smith in his lonely forge. He was a harbour, and harbours, he knew, were always targets. The first few days passed in a tense, watchful silence. Kael kept to his routines, stoking the forge, organising his tools, oiling his levers. It was an attempt to impose normalcy on a situation that was anything but normal. Gorza, as he learned her name was from a quiet word she spoke to her daughter, remained by the fire. She sat mostly upright, even when she slept, her axe always within reach. Her waking hours were spent watching him. He could feel her gaze on his back as he worked the bellows, a heavy, assessing weight. She watched how he moved, how he handled his tools, how he banked the fire at night. He was a puzzle she was trying to solve. He was a human who had not tried to hurt her, trick her, or demand payment for his charity. In her experience, he was an impossibility. Her daughter, Urka, was her shadow. The little girl rarely strayed more than an arm's length from her mother. She would watch him from the safety of Gauze's lap, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a child's natural curiosity. He never tried to approach her directly. He simply existed in her space. Sometimes he would find a piece of interesting slag, a swirl of cooled metal that looked like a bird or a beast, and he would leave it on the hearthstone, not too close to them, before turning his back and busying himself with some task. Hours later, he would notice the piece of metal was gone. On the third day, he saw Gauze test the stitches on her wound. She prodded the bandaged area with a grimace, then slowly, deliberately, stood up. She walked the length of the forge, her limp less pronounced. Her strength was returning. It was like watching a mountain reassemble itself after a rock slide. He felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. A healthy Gauze was a more capable ally. A healthy Gauze was also a more capable threat. She stopped at his quenching barrel, staring down into the dark, oily water. Then she looked at the pile of logs he kept stacked by the door. Without a word, she picked up his spare felling axe. It was a heavy, long-handled tool, balanced for a human's height and strength. In her hands, it looked like a hatchet. He stopped his hammering, watching her. She gave him a short, challenging look. "Wood," she said. It wasn't a question. He simply nodded and went back to his work. He listened to the rhythmic chunk of the axe biting into wood from the yard outside his door. The sound was powerful, efficient, faster than he could have done it. When she returned, she carried an armload of split logs that would have made him take 2 trips. She stacked them neatly by the hearth, then went back out for more. It was the beginning of a change. She was no longer just a patient. She was contributing. It was not a thank you. He understood that. It was a rebalancing of a debt. Orcs, he was learning, did not like to be beholden. The next day, she took his hunting knife and returned it an hour later, its edge honed to a terrifying sharpness he had never been able to achieve. She did not speak of it. She simply left it on his workbench. He found himself adjusting to their presence. The forge felt less empty. The silence was no longer absolute. It was punctuated by the soft murmur of Gauze's voice as she spoke to Urka in their own language, or the quiet sound of the child playing with the metal trinkets he left for her. One evening, he took a small block of yew wood and began to carve. He was not a woodworker, but his hands were steady. He worked by the firelight, the knife strokes slow and precise. Gauze watched him, her expression unreadable. He could feel her curiosity. He did not look up, just kept carving, letting the shape emerge from the wood. A small, fat bear. He sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather until it felt warm and alive in his palm. He set it on the hearth, a little closer than the other things. The next morning, he saw Urka clutching it in her small hand. She was sitting by the fire, tracing the wooden ears with her finger. She looked up and her eyes met his. She didn't flinch away this time. For a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of something other than fear. Then she quickly looked down, hiding the bear in the folds of her tunic. It was a victory, small and fragile, but a victory nonetheless. That night, a cold front moved in, and the temperature plummeted. The forge, usually sweltering, became merely tolerant. He woke in the dead of night to the feel of a heavy weight being laid over him. He jolted upright, his hand reaching for the knife he kept under his straw mattress. Gorza stood over him, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the forge. She had covered him with her own heavy fur cloak. She just stood there for a moment, watching him, before turning and walking back to her spot by the fire, where she and Urka huddled under his own thin wool blankets. He lay there, stunned, the heavy warmth of the fur pressing down on him. It smelled of her, of leather and pine, and something else, something wild and uniquely hers. It was an act of care, a reciprocal gesture. He had covered her wound with his linen, she was covering him with her cloak. It was a transaction, perhaps, but it felt like something more. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside, the weight of the cloak a strange and unfamiliar comfort. The fortress of his solitude was not just cracked, it was beginning to crumble. He started talking then. Not much, just fragments, offered up into the quiet evenings. He told her about the forge, how he'd rebuilt it from a ruin. He spoke of the different tempers of steel, the way you had to listen to the metal to know what it needed. He was talking about his work, but he was also talking about himself, about patience, about pressure, about knowing when to strike and when to let things cool. She listened. He didn't know if she understood all of his words, but she listened with an intensity that made him feel seen for the first time in a decade. One night, emboldened by the shared quiet, he spoke of his past. "I had a family once," he said, his voice quiet. He stared into the flames, not at her. "A wife, a daughter. In the town over the mountains." He paused. "There was a sickness, a lung fever. It took them both in a week." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He had not spoken them aloud in 10 years. He had buried that life, that man. Gorza said nothing. She just sat there, her powerful form a study in stillness. After a long silence she spoke, her voice a low rumble. "My mate was killed," she said. Her gaze was also on the fire. "Betrayed by his own bloodkin. For ambition." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The single word, betrayed, was heavy with a history of pain and violence. "They want her," she added, her hand resting gently on Urka's sleeping head. "To control my clan, my line." He finally understood. Urka was not just a child, she was a political pawn, an heir. And Gorza was not just a warrior, she was a leader, a person of great importance, now brought low by treachery. He looked at her, at the proud set of her jaw, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, and he felt a new kind of respect. They were both survivors, both ghosts haunted by the lives they had lost. The quiet understanding that settled between them after that night was deeper than any pact. It was a bond forged in shared loss, a fragile bridge between two vastly different worlds. He started teaching Urka the names of his tools, pointing to the hammer, the anvil, the bellows. She would repeat the words in her small, serious voice, a smile sometimes touching her lips. Gorza would watch them, and the hard lines of her face would soften, just for a moment. He was beginning to forget what his life had been like before they came. The silence he had once craved now felt like an absence. He had found a new rhythm: heat, hammer, cool, and family. It was a dangerous thought, a foolish one, but it was there, persistent as the heat in the heart of the forge, and he did not have the strength to quench it. The thaw was a fragile thing, a skin of ice over a deep, cold river. It did not take much to break it. It started with the tracks. Kael had gone out at dawn to check his snares, a task he performed with the unthinking ritual of long habit. The ground was soft from the endless rain, a perfect canvas for stories, and it told him one he did not want to read. Boot prints, heavy, hobnailed and deep, at least 3 individuals. They were not the prints of any traders or trappers he knew. They were wide, splayed, the stride long and powerful. Orcs. They had come down from the high pass, circling his forge at a distance, staying within the tree line. They were skilled. They had avoided his usual paths, moving through the dense undergrowth. But they had made a mistake. One of them had stepped on the muddy bank of the stream, leaving a perfect impression. They were scouts, and they had found him. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, extinguishing the small warmth that had begun to grow there. The peace was over. He had known it was temporary, a fleeting gift, but the reality of its end was a physical blow. He hurried back to the forge, his heart pounding a frantic, irregular beat against his ribs. He didn't have to say a word. Gorza saw it on his face the moment he burst through the door. She was instantly on her feet, her hand going to her axe. Urka, sensing the sudden tension, scrambled behind her mother, her small face pale with fear. "Scouts," he said, his voice tight. 3 of them. They've circled the forge. They know we're here. Gorza's expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. She strode to the door and peered through the spy hole, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Forlag's hounds," she spat, the name dripping with venom. "He grows impatient." "They haven't approached," Kael said, his mind racing. He was a smith, not a soldier, but this was his home, his forge, his valley. He knew its every rock, every tree, every shadow. They were probing, looking for weaknesses. "They will come back," Gorza stated. It was a fact, immutable as stone, with more. "Then we need to be ready." The words came out of his mouth before he'd even fully formed the thought. The old Kael would have told them to run, to take their trouble with them. The old Kael would have been trying to figure out how to disappear. But the old Kael was gone, buried under the weight of a fur cloak and the sound of a child's laughter. Gorza looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her amber eyes. She had expected him to cast them out, perhaps, to save himself. She had not expected the we. "This is not your fight, Smith," she said, her voice low. It wasn't a dismissal, but a warning, a final chance for him to step away. "You are in my home," he replied, his voice steady. "They left tracks on my land. That makes it my fight." He looked past her to where Urka was hiding. "It makes it my fight. A silent understanding passed between them. This was no longer about him offering sanctuary. They were now partners in a war they had not chosen. They spent the rest of the day preparing. There was no grand strategy, just practical, grim work. He showed her the deadfalls he'd rigged for catching deer, explaining the trigger mechanisms. She, in turn, showed him how to reinforce the door with a crossbeam he had intended for a cart axle. Her knowledge of siegecraft was instinctive and brutal. He brought his forging hammer, its heavy head polished from use, and set it by the door. He sharpened a spare wood axe for himself, the whetstone whispering against the steel. It was a clumsy weapon, but it was what he had. Gorza inspected his work, took the axe from him, and with a few deft strokes of her own stone, gave it a wickedly sharp edge. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, they put Urka in the safest part of the forge, the small, stone-lined root cellar under the floorboards where he kept his winter supplies. He gave her the wooden bear. "You stay here," he told her gently. "No matter what you hear, you stay quiet until your mother or I come for you." The little girl nodded, her eyes huge and dark. She clutched the bear to her chest, her knuckles white. Gorza knelt and murmured to her in their tongue, a stream of harsh, loving signs. She kissed her daughter's forehead, then closed the heavy trap door, plunging the cellar into darkness. They waited. The forge was quiet except for the low grumble of the fire. The tools were laid out. The weapons were ready. The minutes crawled by, each one a lifetime. He stood by one shuttered window, Gorza by the other. They were a strange pair, the towering orc warrior with her gleaming axe, and the human smith, his face grim, his hands calloused and steady around the haft of his own weapon. The attack came just after the moon rose. There was no warning shout, no battle cry, just a sudden, heavy thud against the main door. Then another. They were using a ram. "West window," Gorza grunted. "Two of them." Kael moved to her side. Peering through a crack in the shutters, he saw two hulking orc shapes trying to pry the window frame from the stone. The wood was old, but thick. It was holding, for now. The main door shuddered again, the wood groaning in protest. "The path to the west window is narrow," Kael said, his voice low and urgent. "A rock slide covered half of it last spring, only room for one at a time to get leverage." He pointed to the forge's secondary hearth, the one he used for fine work. The chimney flue exits right above them. Gorza's eyes lit with a grim understanding. She looked at the pot of quenching oil, a thick, viscous liquid he used for hardening steel. He knew what she was thinking. "It's cold," he said. "It won't burn." "Doesn't need to," she growled. She hefted the heavy iron pot. "Just needs to be slick." While she moved toward the smaller hearth, Kael went to the main door. The ram struck again, and this time a crack appeared, a splintered line down the center plank. They would be through in another minute. He looked at the crossbeam they had set. It was holding, but the door itself was failing. He heard a scramble from the chimney, a guttural curse, and then a satisfying crash and a scream of pain from outside the west window. Gorza's plan had worked. The oil had turned the narrow ledge into a death trap. One of the orcs had slipped and fallen down the steep slope, but the ram at the door struck again, and this time the wood splintered loudly. A hole appeared, big enough to see the snarling face of the orc on the other side. They had lost 2, but there were still at least 2 more, one at the window, one at the door. Gorza was suddenly beside him, her axe held low. "When it comes through, you go left, I go right." The door exploded inward. The ram, a sharpened log carried by a massive tusked orc, burst through the ruined planks. The orc roared in triumph, dropping the log and raising a crude iron sword. Kael didn't think. He moved. He lunged left as Gorza went right. The orc's eyes were on Gorza, the larger threat. It was the mistake Kael had counted on. He swung his felling axe not like a weapon, but like a tool he'd used 1,000 times. He aimed for the knee. The axe bit deep, and the orc screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as his leg buckled. He went down, and Gorza was on him. Her axe fell once, a brutal, efficient arc. The scream cut off. It was over in a second, but another orc was already clambering through the shattered window frame, a jagged knife in his hand. He saw his fallen comrade and let out a roar of fury, charging directly at Gorza, whose back was turned. "Gorza!" Kael yelled. He threw himself forward, bringing his forging hammer up in a desperate 2-handed swing. It was clumsy, slow, but it was all he had. The orc turned, his eyes wide with surprise. The hammer connected with his shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. The orc staggered back, his arm hanging limp, the knife clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, Gorza spun around. Her axe whistled through the air. The fight was over. Silence descended on the forge, thick and heavy, smelling of blood and splintered wood. Kael stood breathing heavily, his arms trembling from adrenaline. He looked at the 2 bodies on his floor, at the ruin of his door. He had killed. He, the quiet smith, had taken a life to defend his home. A wave of nausea washed over him. Gorza stood over the second orc, her chest heaving. She looked at him, her eyes tracing the path from his hammer to the body on the floor. She saw his pale face, his trembling hands. She walked over to him and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Her grip was firm, grounding. "You fight well, Smith," she said. It was the highest praise she could offer. He just shook his head, unable to speak. He looked at the destruction, the blood. This was the price of his choice. This was the storm he had let in. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning. The main tempest was yet to come. The aftermath of the fight was grim. They dragged the bodies out into the rain-swept darkness, away from the forge. Neither of them spoke. The work was heavy, the silence heavier. Kael's hands, so steady with a hammer, felt clumsy and foreign as he gripped the rough leather tunic of a dead orc. He tried not to look at the face. Back inside, the scene was one of violation. The door was a gaping wound. Blood stained the stone floor he had swept clean every night for 10 years. The air, once filled with the comforting sense of his trade, was now tainted with the coppery tang of death. This place had been his sanctuary, a fortress against the world and his own memories. Now it was just a broken-down outpost in a war zone. Gorza worked with brutal efficiency, cleaning her axe, her face a stoic mask. But Kael saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her gaze kept flicking to the trapdoor of the cellar. The first standoff was won, but the victory felt hollow. They had revealed their strength, but they had also confirmed their location. He began patching the door, using spare planks and heavy nails. His hands were shaking, but the familiar work helped. Hammering nails was better than thinking. As he worked, Gorza lifted the trapdoor. He heard her soft murmurings in the orc tongue, and then Urka's small voice answering. A moment later, the little girl climbed out, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She saw the blood on the floor and froze, her small hand flying to her mouth. Gorza scooped her up, holding her tight, shielding her face from the worst of it. She sat with her by the fire, rocking her gently, her low voice a constant, soothing rumble. Kael hammered with more force than was necessary, the rhythmic bangs a desperate attempt to drown out the child's silent terror. They knew the main force would not be far behind. The scouts would be missed, their master would come. The question was not if, but when and how many he would bring. The answer came 2 days later. It was just after dawn. A heavy mist clung to the valley, muffling sound and turning the world into a landscape of grey ghosts. Kael was on watch, perched in the high branches of a tall pine that overlooked the path to his forge. He was stiff, cold, and bone-tired. He saw them first as dark shapes moving in the mist, a slow, inexorable tide of them. Not 4 or 5, at least 20. They moved with the disciplined tread of seasoned warriors, their armor clinking softly, their weapons held ready. At their head walked a figure who was different from the rest. He was massive, even for an orc, clad in black, ornate plate armor that seemed to drink the light. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He carried no weapon in his hands, but a great two-handed mace was strapped to his back. This had to be Vorlag. Kael scrambled down from the tree, his heart a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He ran, heedless of the noise he was making, back to the forge. "He's here," he gasped as he burst through the makeshift door. "Vorlag, with at least 20 warriors." Gorza was already buckling the last strap of her repaired gorget, the very piece of armor he had been working on when this all began. She looked at him, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. She had known this day was coming. She was ready. "Urka," she commanded, her voice sharp. The child, who had been dozing by the fire, was instantly awake. She scurried to the cellar without a word, pulling the wooden bear from her pocket and clutching it tight. She knew the drill. Gorza looked at Kael. "You have done more than any would ask, Smith. There is still time. The forest to the south. You know the paths. Go. Take the child with you." He stared at her, incredulous. She was offering him an escape with the one thing she valued most in the world. It was an act of ultimate trust, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. But he just shook his head. "I told you, this is my home," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I am not leaving, and neither are you." Before she could argue, a voice boomed from outside, a voice that seemed to shake the very stones of the forge. "Gauza, I know you are in there, you and the whelp. Come out, face your clan's judgment." It was Vorlag. He was not attacking, he was parleying. Gauza's lip curled in a snarl. "He wants a show." "Then let's give him one," Kael said. He moved to stand beside her at the door. Gauza hesitated, then gave a short, sharp nod. Together they pushed the barricaded door open and stepped out into the misty morning. Vorlag stood 20 paces away, his warriors fanned out behind him in a silent, menacing crescent. He looked at Gauza, a cruel smile twisting his scarred face. Then his eyes fell on Kael, standing beside her in his leather apron, a simple axe in his hand. Vorlag's smile widened into a look of genuine, contemptuous amusement. "This is what you have been reduced to, Gauza," he boomed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Hiding in a human's hovel, taking shelter with this little man." He gestured dismissively at Kael. "Has the great matriarch of the Stonefang clan fallen so low?" Matriarch. The word hung in the air. Kael felt his blood run cold. He had known she was important, a leader, but a matriarch, a clan chieftain, a queen in all but name. He had been harboring royalty. He looked at Gauza, at her proud, unyielding stance, and suddenly it all made sense. The way she carried herself, the innate authority, the reason she and her daughter were so valuable. And with that understanding came a wave of something else, a bitter, chilling feeling of inadequacy, of betrayal. He was a smith, a nobody from a forgotten valley. She had never told him the full truth. Had he been just a convenience, a tool to be used until a better one came along? The fragile trust he had built, the connection he had felt, it all seemed like a lie, a fantasy he had constructed in his loneliness. He was a fool, playing house with a queen who was so far beyond his station he might as well have been from a different world. Which, he supposed, he was. Vorlag saw the flicker of confusion and hurt on Kael's face, and seized on it. "Did she not tell you, Smith?" he taunted, his voice like poison. "The woman you are protecting is promised to me. Her hand, her clan, her daughter's future, it is all mine by right of conquest. You are sheltering stolen property." Kael's grip tightened on his axe. He felt Gauza's gaze on him, but he couldn't meet it. He felt like a child who had just been shown his place at the adult's table was nothing but a joke. "Enough, Vorlag." Gauza's voice cut across the clearing like iron breaking. "You speak of rights you have not earned, an honor you do not possess. You are a traitor and a usurper." "Strong words for a fugitive," Vorlag sneered. He took a step forward. "Give me the girl, Gauza, and I will grant you a clean death. As for your pet," he looked at Kael with utter disdain, "I will let him watch." That was it. The casual, cruel threat snapped Kael out of his spiral of doubt and hurt. It didn't matter what Gauza was. It didn't matter if he had been a fool. All that mattered was the man standing before him, threatening a woman he had come to care for and a child he had sworn to protect. All the pain and inadequacy coalesced into a single, cold point of anger. "You'll have to come through me first," Kael said, his voice low and steady. Vorlag actually laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "Brave words, little man. They will look good on your tombstone." He drew the massive mace from his back. "Kill them. Burn the forge. I want nothing left but ash." The line of warriors surged forward. The final siege had begun. The world dissolved into a chaos of shouting, steel, and blood. 2 orcs charged Kael immediately, their faces twisted in snarling contempt. They saw him as an obstacle to be brushed aside. He met the first one's wild swing not with force, but with a woodsman's instinct. He ducked under the blade and drove the butt of his axe handle into the orc's throat. The warrior gagged, stumbling back, and Gorza's axe finished the job as she moved past him. She was a whirlwind of destruction. Her axe rose and fell, each blow a masterpiece of brutal economy. She fought not with rage, but with a cold, focused fury, her movements precise and deadly. She was not just a warrior, she was a master of the craft of war, and this was her forge. Kael fought with desperation. He was no match for them in strength or skill, but he had the terrain. He led his attackers into the cluttered yard behind the forge, a maze of stacked iron bars, half-finished projects, and discarded tools. He used his knowledge of the space, tripping one orc over a pile of slag, forcing another into a narrow gap where his broad shoulders became a liability. He did not fight to win. He fought to survive, to buy seconds. The forge itself became a battleground. Orcs smashed through the windows, their roars echoing in the stone building. Kael saw one of them raising a torch to the dry thatch of the roof. He bellowed in rage and charged, tackling the orc and sending them both crashing into a rack of his finest tools. Swords, chisels, and tongs rained down around them. He looked up and saw the roof catch. A small tongue of flame licked at the thatch, then grew with terrifying speed. His home was burning. Everything he had built, everything he owned, was turning to smoke and ash. A profound, gut-wrenching despair washed over him. It was all gone. Through the smoke and chaos he saw Gorza. She was pressed back against the anvil, fighting 3 of Vorlag's personal guard at once. She was tiring, a small cut bleeding on her forehead. She was magnificent, and she was losing. Vorlag stood back, watching, a satisfied smirk on his face. Something inside Kael snapped. The despair turned to pure, incandescent rage. They were not just destroying his home. They were trying to extinguish this brilliant, fierce light in front of him. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a massive, unfinished sledgehammer head, a solid block of steel, and heaved it with all his might at Vorlag. It was a desperate, impossible throw, but it made Vorlag flinch and take a step back. And that was enough. The momentary distraction was all Gorza needed. She roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and surged forward, her axe a blur. One of her opponents fell, then another. The battle was turning, but the cost was devastating. The forge was an inferno. The roof was collapsing, sending showers of sparks and burning timbers down into the chaos. They were running out of time and space. It was in that moment, surrounded by fire and death, that Gorza made her stand. She planted her feet amidst the ruin of his life's work, her face illuminated by the flames, and she raised her voice in a formal cry that cut through the din of battle.
"Forlag," she bellowed. "You claim leadership by conquest, but you lead only curs and cowards."
She turned her head, her burning gaze finding Kael where he stood, silhouetted against the fire. "I am Gorza, matriarch of the Stonefang, and I choose my own path. I choose my own allies." Her voice rose, taking on the timbre of a formal declaration, a binding oath spoken before witnesses, even if those witnesses were enemies. "Before the spirits of the mountain and the forge, I claim this man, Kael the smith. He will not be my servant, but my counsel, not my subject, but my consort. His hearth will be my hearth, his hammer will be my clan's hammer. He stands beside me. Who among you dares challenge my choice?" Silence. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the battlefield. The orcs, even Vorlag's own warriors, stared at her, then at Kael. A human. She had just publicly, formally, declared a human as her chosen partner. It was an act of political defiance so profound, so utterly against their traditions, that it stunned them all into inaction. Kael stood frozen, the heat of the fire on his back, the weight of her words crashing down on him. Consort. His hearth will be my hearth. It was not a lie. It was not a manipulation. It was a declaration of war against her own culture, made in the middle of a battle for her life. She was not using him. She was raising him up, pulling him into the center of her world in the most public way possible. She was seeing him, not as a little man, but as an equal, as hers. Vorlag was the first to recover. His face was a mask of purple rage. "Blasphemy! You shame our ancestors. You would mate with a lesser creature," he roared. "Then you will die with him." He charged, his mace raised. But his moment of hesitation had cost him. Gorza met his charge, not alone, but with Kael suddenly at her side, his face set like iron. The final confrontation was here, amidst the flames of the life Kael was leaving behind, for the sake of the one that had just been offered to him. The duel was brutal. Vorlag's mace was a weapon of pure, crushing force. Gorza's axe was a blur of deadly speed. Kael, armed only with his felling axe and a smith's resilience, became a third point in the deadly dance. He did not try to match Vorlag's strength. He harried him, forcing him to turn, to divide his attention. He used the collapsing forge to his advantage, kicking over a bucket of nails that sent Vorlag stumbling, using a falling beam as a momentary shield. He was no warrior, but he was a partner. He anticipated Gorza's movements, creating openings for her, protecting her flank. They moved together, a strange but effective unit forged in fire and desperation. Vorlag, for all his power, was fighting two opponents, one he could not overpower, and one he could not predict. The end came when a massive roof beam, engulfed in flames, finally gave way. It crashed down between them, separating Kael from the two dueling orcs. Vorlag, seeing his chance to finish Gorza without interference, pressed his attack with renewed fury. He drove her back, step by step, until her back was against the great stone hearth of the forge. His mace came down in what should have been a final, crushing blow, but Gorza, using the hearth as a brace, deflected the blow with the flat of her axe. The impact sent a jarring shock through both of them. For a split second, Forlag was overextended, his guard down. It was the only opening she would get. She dropped her axe and lunged forward, under his guard, driving the point of her own broken gorget, the one Kael had repaired, up under Forlag's jaw. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but it worked. Forlag gave a choked, gargling cry, staggering backward, his hands flying to his throat. Goza collapsed to her knees, exhausted, her axe lost. Forlag stood for a moment, swaying, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. Then he fell, crashing down onto the anvil Kael had used for a decade. The anvil, the heart of the forge, gave a dull, resonant ring. And then there was silence, save for the roar of the fire. Forlag's warriors stared, leaderless and defeated. The fight was gone from them. Some turned and fled into the mist. Others simply dropped their weapons, their shoulders slumping. The siege was over. Kael scrambled over the burning beam. He rushed to Goza's side, helping her to her feet. She leaned on him, her body trembling with exhaustion. They stood together, watching his home, his past, burn to the ground. Everything he had was gone. He looked at her, at the soot on her face, the blood on her brow, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He thought of her declaration, "His hearth will be my hearth." He had no hearth left. In the quiet aftermath, amidst the smoking ruins, they tended to their wounds. The fire had consumed everything, leaving only the stone walls and the great blackened anvil, which now held the body of the usurper. Gorza's remaining loyalists, a small band who had been fighting at the laying action in the pass, finally arrived, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion as they took in the scene. They looked at Gorza, their matriarch, and then at the human standing beside her, his clothes torn, his face smudged with soot, but his posture unbroken. They saw their dead enemies and their dead leader. They saw the ruin of the forge, and they heard the story in whispers from the warriors who had surrendered. They heard of Gorza's declaration. Gorza, her strength slowly returning, addressed Kael. Her public voice was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. "What I said, it was a binding oath, Kael. In our tradition, it cannot be unsaid." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the smouldering timbers of what was once his roof. "I know. It offers you my protection," she continued, "a place in my clan, a future." He finally turned to look at her. He saw the question in her eyes, the uncertainty. She had made a tremendous gamble, and she did not know if he would accept the stakes. He thought about the life that was offered, a life of politics and danger, of being a human consort in a world of orcs, a world that would likely always see him as lesser. "I accept," he said, and he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. But he held up a hand, on one condition. Her brow furrowed. "Name it." "I will not be your protected pet, Gorza," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "I will not be hidden away in your halls like a strange trinket. I will not be your human consort." He spat the title out like it was ash. "I am Kael. I am a smith, the man who stood with you when his world burned down. He took a step closer, his gaze locking with hers. If I come with you, I stand beside you, not behind you, not beneath you. They will see me as I am, a human, your partner. If they cannot accept that, if you cannot accept that, then I will take my hammer and find a new stone to build on. He was laying his own terms. He was no longer the passive caregiver, the reluctant host. He was an active partner, demanding to be seen and respected for his own worth, not for the status she had bestowed upon him. Gorza stared at him for a long moment. He saw a storm of emotions in her eyes, surprise, respect, and something else, something deep and warm. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her, and it transformed her harsh features into something beautiful. "Then you will need this," she said. She bent down and retrieved her axe from where it had fallen. She did not hand it to him. Instead, she turned and offered the haft to one of her own warriors. Then she walked to the rubble and pulled his own forging hammer from the debris. It was blackened and scarred, but the head was still solid, the handle still sound. She held it out to him. "A smith needs his hammer." He took it. The weight was familiar, a part of him. It was an answer, an acceptance of his terms. They had to leave. There was nothing left for them in the valley but ghosts and ashes. They gathered what little they could salvage, a few tools, some food, the clothes on their backs. Kael went to the cellar and brought out a terrified but unharmed Urka. She ran into her mother's arms, but her eyes, as she was lifted up, were on Kael. She held the little wooden bear up for him to see, as if to say, "I kept it safe." He managed a small, tired smile for her. As they prepared to depart, one of Gorza's warriors, a grizzled old orc with one eye, approached Kael. He looked Kael up and down, his gaze lingering on the forging hammer in his hand. "You are the smith?" the old orc grunted. "I am," Kael said. The orc nodded slowly. "Our fortress at Stonefang is half crumbled. Our weapons are dull. Vorlag let everything rot." He grunted again. "A clan needs a matriarch who can fight, but it also needs one who can build." He gave Kael a look of grudging respect and walked away. It was a beginning. They walked away from the forge without looking back. Gorza led the way, her warriors falling in behind her. Kael walked beside her, his hammer in his hand, Urka holding on to his other hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. They were a strange sight, the orc matriarch, the human smith, and the child who bound them together. They were leaving the ashes of one life and walking toward the uncertainty of another. But they were walking together. The journey back to Stonefang was arduous. They moved through harsh, unforgiving mountains that cared little for status or species. Kael, who had thought his small valley was the entirety of the wild, was humbled by the sheer scale of the world. He faced prejudice, as he knew he would. Gorza's warriors watched him constantly. Their acceptance was not freely given. They saw a small, soft-skinned creature walking beside their leader. They muttered in their own tongue, and while he did not understand the words, the scorn was universal. They tested him, not with overt challenges, but with small cruelties. They set a punishing pace. They gave him the heaviest packs. They offered him the worst cuts of meat. He did not complain. He did not falter. He simply endured. He met their pace, carried the packs without comment, and ate what he was given with quiet dignity. His resilience, born of a decade of solitude and grief, was a different kind of strength than they were used to, and it confused them. His worth was proven not in a fight, but around a campfire. One of the warrior's axes lost its edge, the steel chipped and dull. The orc, a particularly surly one named Gruel, was ready to discard it. Kael took it from him. He had no forge, no anvil, but he had his hammer and a lifetime of knowledge. He found the right river stones, a hard one for shaping and a fine one for honing. He spent the entire evening by the fire, patiently, expertly tapping, grinding, and sharpening. He worked until the chipped blade was whole again, its edge keener than it had been before. He handed it back to Gruel. The orc took it, tested the edge with a calloused thumb, and stared at Kael with a new expression. It was not friendship, but it was respect. From that day on, his pack was a little lighter. When they finally reached the fortress of Stonefang, it was as the old warrior had said. It was a mighty place, carved into the mountain itself, but it was decaying. The great iron-bound gates hung crookedly on their hinges. Sections of the wall had crumbled. It was a reflection of the clan itself, strong in foundation, but neglected and rotting from within. Gorza's return was met with a mixture of celebration and suspicion. Vorlag's influence ran deep. Kael became a symbol of that division. To some, he was a sign of their matriarch's unforgivable transgression. To others, he was a curiosity, a symbol of a new way forward. He ignored the whispers and the glares. He had a purpose. He found the old ruined clan forge. It was a disaster, abandoned for years, but the core of it was good. The stone was sound. The mountain's drafts could be teamed into a perfect flue. He set to work. He cleared the rubble, repaired the bellows, built a new hearth. Gorza's loyalists, seeing him work with the craftsman's obsessive focus, slowly began to help. They brought him coal. They found old tools. They watched, fascinated, as he brought the dead forge back to life. His first act was to repair the great gates. It was a monumental task. He designed new iron braces, forged new hinges the size of a man's chest. Orcs who had only ever known how to break things now learned from him how to make them. He didn't command them, he showed them. He taught the strong ones how to swing the sledgehammers in rhythm, the patient ones how to work the bellows. He created a team, a purpose. The sound of hammers on steel, once Kael's solitary song, now became the anthem of Stonefang's rebirth. Months passed. The fortress became stronger. The weapons became sharper. The clan, seeing these tangible results, began to change its mind. They saw the human not as a weakness, but as a source of strength they had never known they lacked. He was the quiet, steady hand that was mending their broken world. One evening, a year after they had left his valley in ashes, Gorza came to the forge. It was late, the fires were banked, the hammers silent. Kael was alone, oiling a newly forged hinge for the inner keep. The forge was larger than his old one, but he had made it his own. It smelled of coal, iron, and honest work. She stood there for a moment, watching him. She was no longer the desperate fugitive. She was the matriarch, clad in dark leathers and steel, the weight of her people on her shoulders. But in the quiet of the forge, with him, she was just Gorza. He looked up and smiled, a real, easy smile. "The gate will be finished tomorrow," he said.
She nodded, walking closer.
"The council argues less these days," she said. "The larders are full, the walls are strong, the clan is healing." "Good," he said simply, turning back to his work. She came to stand behind him. He felt her presence, a familiar warmth and strength. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. In her hands, she held a piece of armor, a gorget, his work, the very first thing that had connected them. It was dented and scarred from a dozen battles fought since, a testament to the life they now lived. "A new dent," she said, her voice low, "from a skirmish in the North Pass." He took it from her, his hands tracing the familiar lines, the new wound in the steel. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had found this piece, a lonely man in a lonely valley. He set it on the anvil. "I can fix it," he said. She didn't move away. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. He picked up his hammer, but before he could strike, her hand covered his, stilling the movement. Her hand was large and calloused, scarred like his own, but her touch was gentle. "Kael," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her. Her amber eyes, which had once held only suspicion and pain, were now filled with a deep, unwavering affection. "My home was a fortress of stone," she said. "Yours was a small house of wood and fire. Both are gone." She brought his hand, still holding the hammer, to her chest, placing it over her heart. "This is our home now. This is our hearth." He looked from her eyes to their joined hands on her chest, the smith's hammer and the warrior's heart. He had lost everything to find a place where he was not just needed, but truly seen. He had learned that a home wasn't a place you built with stone and wood, but something you forged under pressure and heat with another person. It was a choice made in the face of a hostile world, and it was stronger than any fortress. He leaned in and kissed her, a quiet, certain kiss amidst the shadows and the lingering warmth of the forge. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain peaks, but inside, the silence was peaceful, earned, and complete.